So, Wade, it's my pleasure to be here in your office again in Oakland. And I know that we don't have a lot of time, so I'll get right into it. I sent you some information on 6 and 9 strand DNA, and I hope you had an opportunity to look at it. And let's start there in terms of how would you analyze that data, and what does that mean to African people, and how does it empower African people, just knowing?
Yeah, I think that it's a very important, scientific explanation of what many of us have already known, and but the importance of it is that if we make the United States, that gives us a grounding in our location in humanity, and a lot of the difficulties, I think, as a black psychologist for our people, is that we've been trying to grapple with the notion of identity as a result of being discriminated against because of our race. So we've been racialized as opposed to humanized. And this particular work demonstrates...
Can you kind of go over the work so our viewing public will understand?
I'm not sure. I'll try, but essentially, my understanding of it, because it's very technical, my understanding of it is that this particular piece shows irrefutable evidence that in terms of the genetic dispersion of humanity, that it singularly comes out of Africa. Correct. And that the first human beings were in fact Africans, and that the sub-Saharan African population, and I'm sorry I didn't mention it, but I think that it also extends to Africans throughout the diaspora, have a genetic code that is far more similar to the original genetic code of human beings, of Homo sapiens sapiens, and that gets variegated or dispersed in other racial populations, and so that finding alone is an important one in terms of locating us in the beginning of humanity, as opposed to us being some recent racial group that's been discriminated against. And that what I was trying to come to in this point is that the one of the problems, if not a major problem for African Americans in the diaspora in the United States, is that we've been struggling with a notion of identity as compensating for our inferior status, or our being enslaved, and then because of the 13th or 14th Amendment given rights in America. And that makes our worldview the worldview of a people who are grounded in the presence or absence of national license in America, as opposed to a people who are grounded in the fundamental core of what it means to be human. And that's a larger, more profound identity, if we can make that well known, that African people are the people. and all these other things are kind of social constructions, but they're political arrangements that can be unarranged.
Well, one of the key points in that study, and the key point for me, was that they determined, this was 15 geneticists from the most famous universities around the world. It was housed in Yale University. And what they determined was that the greater the number of DNA series within a species, whether that's ape, human, or whatever, the greater the potential for genius and creativity. For an example, the ape species has, the ape family has 3 species. It has the orangutan, it has the gorilla, it has the monkey. The orangutan has 3 series of DNA. Pretty smart animal, but not as smart as the gorilla. Gorilla, you can teach to interact with that computer. I mean, he can cut it on and off, you know. But he has 4 strands. He has 4 series of DNA. And he's not as smart as the chimpanzee, which has 5 strands of DNA. And you can teach a chimpanzee to type up to 200 words. They've taught him to type up to 200. He has 5. All human beings have 6 strands of DNA, except Africans, born below the Sahara, they have 9 strands of DNA. And what I was trying to focus on is if there's that much with one strand of DNA between the chimpanzee and the human being, and you see what the human being can do and what the chimpanzee can do, and Africans who have 9 and Europeans and all other people have 6, what does that extra 3 strands of DNA import to African people? And the reason, and I've called the head of the genetics department and personally talked with Dr. Kidd, who headed up that study. They copyrighted that study and refused to make that study public. And that was what I was trying to get at. What does that knowledge, just knowing that African people have 9 DNA series, and that's where they got that whole, unravel that whole genome and come to the conclusion that yes, all people come out of Africa, because Africans still have all of the original prototype genetic material when other people in the world have less. But Africans maintain. So I wanted, as a psychiatrist, to look at that from your perspective, because what we think and what we believe, our very consciousness transforms our being. And I want you to speak on that.
The problem, as I see it, is that we're continuing to compare ourselves either inferior or superior to a white standard. And so the revelation that we have 9 strands and other sub-Saharan human beings have, Africans have 9 strands and other human beings throughout the world have 6, is still really comparing ourselves with their standard of what is genius and what is creativity. You see, because if you don't first of all say what is African genius, what is African creativity, and it's free to express itself, then we're still captured in the evidence of genius based upon what we know to be human accomplishments. So you look at America. In Africa today, with all those 9 strands, Africans are running bent like hell to get to America because they see America as this place of opportunity and power and greatness, and they're judging genius based upon an American standard.
Correct.
As opposed to developing genius, expressing that creativity as African. So that the fact that we have 9 and other people have 6 doesn't really excite me, because we're still trapped in a European hegemony about all human activity. And if I said, well, if we have 9 strands, what is the evidence of our additional strands correlating with genius? When we go to genius, we look at white folks as exemplars of creativity, power, intelligence, genius. We never bother to say, let's establish our own benchmark as African people, and then see how those 9 strands inform us or benefit us. Right now, they don't benefit us. Everywhere in the world, African people are on some version of the bottom of anybody's well-being and social structures. Everywhere, including in Africa. And so in terms of me looking at issues like quality of life, issues of fulfilling one's human possibilities, we're still, again, measuring that by a standard that is not African.
I'm trying to break through, and then how do we make this transformation from dependency and powerlessness to power, leadership, to manufacturing all that we need, and so much of it has to do with our own perception of our own abilities and our own self. And I'm trying to look at that from a psychological perspective.
That's the point I'm trying to really come to, because it seems to me if we don't define what it means to be human, what does it mean to walk in the world as a unique and valuable human being with an African face? Because there are other unique and valuable human beings on the planet that have Asian face, Latino face, Native American faces, and all of them should be able to express their possibilities to their completeness by walking in the world as a unique and valuable human being. Africans have been derailed from that process, so any issues of success any issues of greatness have been defined as you are great to the extent that you walk in the world looking like other folk, being like other folk. That's our psychological tragedy, is that we have not been able to establish or to reclaim, because we in ancient times we did it, but we haven't been able to reclaim our expression of humanity as pure genius that cannot be disconnected from us being African. See, now our genius is always disconnected from being African. When you see African genius, it is always in spite of their being African. Like we have to overcome our Africanness in order to be great. You know, we have to be something else in order to be great. And so, but in prior times, our genius could not be disconnected from our being African or being the first humans. Because for a long time, we were the only human beings in the world.
Correct.
You know, all human beings were African. Then, you know, through migrations and travel and dispersions throughout the world, the human phenotype variegated, and we got these other races. And then psychologically, social constructions within those races define their value. And unfortunately, the value of African people was defined by this onslaught of white supremacy, that African being becomes the antithesis of whiteness, and whiteness by definition is the good, so we have to be the bad. And so we haven't been able to reclaim, rescue our sense of being grounded in excellence and in genius because we're African, not in spite of us being African.
Now, how does our consciousness and what we believe impact our ability to be creative, to actually produce?
See, there's an adage that I'd like to use with my students that I think it addresses that. And the adage is that ideas are the substance of behavior. If you have an idea or a belief that black people are inferior, then all your behaviors as black people or other people looking at black people will be only seen as reinforcing our inferiority. You won't even see the genius of black people if you have an idea that black people are inferior. So your belief about and this probably comes out of the invasion of Africa and the kidnapping and stealing of our people and dispersing us throughout the world under colonialism and under slavery. That the idea there was really to dehumanize us. So a new concept was created, a new idea, a new belief. And that belief was that these people, these men and women of bondage, were not men and women. They were in fact chattel. We were in fact less than human. And while many scholars talk about human communities all over the world from the beginning of time have had systems of slavery or systems of bondage, it is our experience that is unique because we were the first people put into bondage with the equation that we deserve to be in bondage because we were less than human. The Romans, the Greeks, all these other slave societies never saw their slaves as less than human. But chattel slavery for us tried to define us as less than human, and in effect was an attempt at dehumanizing us to make us goats, cows, equivalent to goats, cows, other animals. That idea, that belief, then dictates all the constructions that societies create. It is not accidental that we've had this whole history of discrimination and the idea, just the simple things about black people having to drink out of dirty, nasty trough fountain versus a white water fountain, or going to a certain dirty, nasty convenience rather than a clean, healthy convenience. All those discriminatory acts were not just discriminations of a people, but it was saying you deserve this because you're less than human. So our rather than drinking out of a water fountain, drinking out of a bucket or a trough is what animals do. So it wasn't seen, the belief was not astonishing that black people were drinking out of troughs or dirty fountains, because that's what animals do. Animals, dogs and mules and cows will drink out of a dirty bucket of water. Humans don't do that. So if we're less than humans, it is right for us to drink out of this dirty bucket of water. So the idea, the belief that we were less than human dictated the treatment of us in to the extent that we internalized ourselves that belief, it dictated what we would expect or would allow to happen to us. Now that's an important point, because we never fully accepted maltreatment. I mean, the fact that we had a major civil rights movement, the fact that during our enslavement there were almost daily slave revolts and the maroon communities that we established that later evolved into becoming these black townships. All those historical experiences are evidence that we never accepted the idea or the belief that we were less than human. If we had accepted it, then we'd be like cows. We simply would have let them hurt us anywhere they hurt us, kill us when they kill us. But we resisted that. So it never happened. Even though there was a major attempt to take our minds away from us, and we would not think freely as human beings think. And even today, some of that we see in the educational process that's going on around educating black kids, or the opposition to African-centered education, because the idea of African-centered education is not just we want to have our stories told. It is fundamentally that as human beings, we have to express our own essence and I say express our own essence in every experience. See those E's, essence, expression, and experience. Those express our essence in every experience that we engage in. So we have to Africanize the world that we live in order to maximize our human possibility and potential. Now, many people don't understand that. They just see us, we talk about African-centered education as we want to have, Black History Month. We want to make sure we have our heroes talked about or our great achievements. But it's more than that. It is the fact that human beings have this almost instinct to make equivalent their essence as expressed. That's why all this stuff around blackness, black color, I mean, and the assault on pigmentation is important, because this skin color is an important expression of our African essence. And when you defame that expression, you deny the essence. And what's real is my spirit, my African spirit. I express it as a black person, as a black man, and then the environment in which I live in has to also give license to that expression. So we should create aesthetic. We should create beauty that symbolically shows the African genius. If African children are involved, or African, not just children, all of us are living in that kind of experience. So these things get all connected together in terms of the ideas. And I was just reading a student of mine just sent me an email asking me to give her best wishes for an interview she's having on campus for this international study abroad program. And in the international study abroad program, the managers of it tell the students, come dressed appropriately, because that your first impression is going to influence how the faculty panel sees you as a viable candidate. And they went so far as details to say women should wear business suits, men should wear suits and ties. All right. Now, why is a suit and tie evidence of my capacity and ability to benefit from an international experience? Other than the managers of that see that you cannot do well if you don't act like us, if you don't be like us, you don't look like us, and so you don't have to wear a suit and tie to show that you're intelligent. You don't have to have a tie on to show that you are a good ambassador for the best that this nation has to offer to the world. But see, that's a very minor point. But it's a major point, because all those young people, now these are freshmen, sophomores, and juniors who are being shaped for participating in the world of adult affairs. But she's being brainwashed, or at least her mind is being contaminated to believe that her capacity does not exist unless she expresses that capacity in some European version of what is proper attire. This
is exactly what I'm getting at, Wade, is how consciousness actually affects our ability to create, how confidence affects our ability even to relate. It affects how we see the world, how we perceive the world. And one of the things in looking at the Sean Bell case and all of the murders where people just feel free that they can shoot black people, black men especially, down and get away with it because black men are perceived as less than human. And you're putting your finger on it, and I just wanted to try to get into that a little deeper in terms of perception. How we perceive each other and the world affects our ability to do things.
You see, the point I mean, I do what you're saying. I'm struggling with trying to make this clear. The dilemma for us is that our perception is that we are a discriminated race. That we are black people have been discriminated by white people, and once we convince white people that we're deserving of being next to them, they will stop discriminating against us. But that's not the problematic.
Absolutely.
The problematic is that there's been an assault on our fundamental humanity. And once I realized that the white people are maltreating me is because they don't see me as a valuable human being, then it's a different response versus they're just discriminating against me because I'm a Negro and they had some laws back in the day that said Negroes could not eat at this counter. See, so my civil rights response, and this is what Malcolm was really trying to show us a long time ago, my civil rights response is inadequate for the problems that we experience in modern society, because it is a human violation that is being perpetrated against us, and until we object to being dehumanized, then all this give me black mayors, or now we got a young brother thinks he'll be the president, all this stuff that's going on are not going to solve the problem of the masses of black people, because the masses of us, and I would say all of us, are victims of dehumanization, not racial discrimination. Racial discrimination is sort of the smoke screen that we are suffering from, because we think that that's what the problem is in America. But the fact of the matter that when you shoot a young black man 20 times, you're not saying I'm discriminating against you. You're saying this thing is not a human, and I can do atrocious, unbelievably aberrant kinds of stuff toward them because it's like me kicking a dog or me stepping on a cockroach. You know, that I don't have the same sense of pain, of the tragedy of their hurt, because they're not human. And so that's the real issue to me is this human violation and not this racial discrimination. And we've been racialized, so every discussion is about our race, which the best thinking of modern science says that, even the genome says that in terms of the human phenotype, there's very little difference of all people, and race is a construct that doesn't really provide us with any value in understanding what's going on. And even though the genome people like to talk about that all humans are roughly 90 or 98% the same, but they're talking about that in terms of 10% of the genome of the full genetic makeup. And so I like to ask, well, if we're 90% the same with 10%, what about the other 90% of our genetic pool? What does that measure? And they sometimes talk about that as that's actually junk DNA. They use the terminology that stuff is junk DNA. But I tend to believe that there is a divine mastermind here, and I wouldn't see the divine mastermind creating a phenomena where 10% is valuable and 90% is junk. That just doesn't add up to anybody's sense of mathematics to me. And so I suspect that the 90% has to do with our spiritual essence and not our physical makeup. The 10% really talks about our physical makeup, and the 90% talks about our spirit makeup. And that we get to explore that, because we don't even have the tools for doing that. We don't have the tools for critiquing and understanding and dissecting the spirit phenomena. We do very well with the physical phenomena, but that's another probably century coming.
Now, I want to get to that, but I just want you to deal with an aspect of a question, since we were talking about we've been dehumanized. And one of the...
no, but be careful, because I want you to hear this. There was an attempt to dehumanize us.
Thank you.
Looking at our response to that, it was never done. It was never ever completed.
Yes.
Because our resistance is evidence that humans resist destruction. Mm-hmm. Humans have a natural capacity to resist their own destruction. And we have just pure evidence, nothing but evidence, to show even today, even some of this gangbanging we're seeing in this rebellion we're seeing in our urban children is really an example of resistance. Mm-hmm. You know, and so the resistance, when you see resistance, you see humanity. Mm-hmm. You see no resistance, then maybe the dehumanization is incomplete. Mm-hmm.
But there's so much. I mean, in all these books, the first thing they say is that, Africans sold themselves into slavery. Now, Wade, you've been all over Africa. You've been initiated as a priest, as a nana, leader, so forth. How do you, I haven't found any evidence of Africans selling themselves into slavery beyond the fact that you can always get some people to work for you and work with you. Mm. But the evidence that I've come across is that we have different cultural perspectives. Mm-hmm. And a different way of how our culture handled different things. Mm-hmm. But the concept of Africans selling their children and other people into slavery, knowing, this kind of setup is absolutely absurd. And I need you to speak to that, because our people need to understand.
It's not only absurd, absurd, it is also a fabrication that's been created with malintent. Mm. The evidence shows that if you look at this, it's a long period. That we look at Europe's going into invading Africa. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, Africans had systems. We had systems that allowed us to serve each other.
Correct.
To serve each other. And sometimes that service was in response to a debt. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that service was in response to having lost a wager. Sometimes that wager being a war. All right, mm-hmm. But in every case, the servant had full human rights and privileges. The servant, and then there's several documents of the servant being now married into another community within a servant and rise in that community up to the point of almost to being leadership mm-hmm. in that community, mm-hmm. because they never gave away or had taken away from them their human rights and possibilities. Mm-hmm. Now, when European scholars, Western scholars talk about Africans sold each other into slavery, they are misperceiving slavery with servitude. Mm-hmm. And it was servitude for us until we internalized their definitions of that human relationships. You know that many times I talk about the definition of power being the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. Mm-hmm. At the point that Africans begin to accept the definition of human relationships that Europe brought into Africa, then you see Africans engaging in slavery under the same precept that the Europeans did. Mm-hmm. But that's a mental translation, a mental transformation. So one could argue that those Africans, and this is late in the historical game, mm-hmm. one could argue that those Africans who we have evidence of participating in the slave trade, being the middle managers, being the marketeers of slavery, they had changed their minds to think like Europeans. Mm-hmm. So they weren't Africans selling slaves, they were Europeanized Africans selling slaves. Mm-hmm. And because mentally they now had a different worldview. Mm-hmm. The African grounded worldview always had room for service, mm-hmm. didn't have room for slavery, and especially didn't have a concept of chattel slavery, mm-hmm. where you lost your humanity in order for me to exploit your labor. Mm-hmm. See, so there's a mental, a mind transplant that has to be added to the equation of understanding how Africans participated in enslaving our own people. And those Africans whose minds were corrupted, then become actively seeing slavery as the same advantage as the Europeans did. But that's a new advent in our mental consciousness.
Brother Wade, I want to go back to the spiritual component, because therein I believe is the key to our transformation, is spirit, and you touched on it with that 90%. Now I went to church Sunday, and I would have laughed from what I was looking at, with the exception that I knew that it had real components as well as psychological and just deception. The preacher went to church, he's preaching, he's jumping, he's hollering, called people up to pray for him, laid hands on them and poured oil on their head, and then blew on them and blew them down completely unconscious. The whole family remained on the floor for about 5 minutes. What was going on?
I don't know. What church was that?
This is one of the Pentecostal healing, divine healing. But people came expecting to be healed. I mean, you know, you were expecting all this. You've been worked up to believe this. So I mean, and that's why I say, if I had not, if I would laugh with the exception. I understand that if this is your expectation and you believe that this is going to happen, I mean, you have an agreement with the practitioner to fall out. I mean, you already seen this enough times and you know what is expected. So that becomes real. But I wanted you to deal with the spiritual concept.
Your answer is my answer as well. That there's sort of a contract, a mental contract that we perform based upon what we've been taught is this spirit power. That's separate from the fact that there is spirit power, and that once one aligns themselves as spirit beings, we can do unbelievable things.
Absolutely.
You know, but a lot of that, I think, is performance that comes from expectation, contract. But the idea of us being spirit beings is deep in African wisdom traditions, and what some people call African philosophies, wisdom traditions. And those wisdom traditions, particularly the Bantu Congo or the Niger Congo, which I have come to accept as 3/4 of Africa. That there was, in fact, there's documented linguistically that there's this Bantu expansion that goes from West Africa, actually starts in Kemet, comes down to West Africa, and goes all the way down almost to South Africa, of one linguistic family. All right? And if they recognize a linguistic family, you have to ask the question, why do humans have language? They have language in order to express their cultural beliefs, because culture is the general design for living and patterns for interpreting reality. So if there's a linguistic expansion, there has to be a cultural expansion. So Africa has this massive plot of geography, is really almost one major, actually 5, people say there are 5 major cultural linguistic areas in Africa that are distinguishable. And the largest one is this Bantu Congo. So we are Bantu people.
Right.
And the Bantu have an understanding of the spirit as being an unfolding energy. And I think, as I read it, it's very much that the quantum physicists today are catching up to what Bantu, our ancestors, understood as a nature reality. And they say that to be human is to be a 3-fold unfolding of spirit. There's an unfolding that is yet to be born. That there's an energy that's unfolding in the pre-life. There's an unfolding in our life we're living right now. So it's unfolding. And then there's an unfolding of spirit in the afterlife. And that cycle continues forever. So we are a 3-folding, unfolding spirit. Now, if I think about that in terms of the Genome Project, and this 90% of, unquote, junk DNA, maybe this 90% of junk DNA is that I have an existence, me, Wade Nobles, have an existence of unfolding my spirit that's noble and knowing before I was born.
Correct.
old folks said, well, my father would say, you know, I knew you as a spark in my eye before you knew yourself. Mm-hmm. All right? Because our parents knew some being was coming. Mm-hmm. But that being didn't start to be once it came, it was already being. Mm-hmm. That's in the yet to be born. And so how we talk about spirit then is how do we map into this unfolding energy, this energy that is everlasting, that is transformative, that is ascending. Mm-hmm. And if we can ever get to that analysis of us being spirit, energy, power, force as beings, then I walk in the world now as a spirit. And if I go even further, that where's that spirit, what activates that spirit? It is a God force, mm-hmm. or a almighty spirit, and I can't see intellectually how I distinguish my being from the God being. Mm-hmm. And if I am the same being as God, how would I dare allow myself to be put in a category of inferiority? Mm-hmm. See, so this consciousness you kept referring to really comes about as a consciousness of who we really are as human beings. And who we are as human beings in the African wisdom traditions is that we're spirit forces. Mm-hmm. We're spirit. I'm a universe. Mm-hmm. I am literally a universe unto myself that is interconnected and interlaced with all the other universes called African people everywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. It seems to me we could actually then think about how do I communicate with other spirit beings without opening my mouth. Mm-hmm. And our grandparents did all the time. They'd have a feeling. They start rubbing their elbow. Something don't feel right. I have a premonition. They open, and I ain't called him and said, "Daddy, I'm in jail. Daddy, I'm in trouble." But he had a feeling. I better go check on that boy. I better go see what he's up to. Mm-hmm. You see, so that's conversation. That's spirit talk. Mm-hmm. My spirit is hollering out for help. Mm-hmm. And my father's spirit or my mother's spirit is hearing that, and neither of us open our mouths. Mm-hmm. You know, and so that kind of stuff also enwraps how we even do healing. Mm-hmm. How to do healing, because I have a relationship with the health spirit. Mm-hmm. Health is a spirit. Mm-hmm. Dis at ease or disease is a spirit. Mm-hmm. Well, my spirit can have a conversation with the spirit of the disease. Mm-hmm. And we see that in traditional healing practice in Africa. Mm-hmm. We also see it in African America, where old folks would come around when someone got sick and sit up with them. And just sit up in a room and hum and moan and talk, and they would gather in a room, and they call it sitting up. Mm-hmm. And they don't say much. Mm-hmm. But what's going on is a spirit conversation of having a conversation with disease that you have to leave this person. Mm-hmm. You can't have this person. But we didn't have the insight to talk about our practice that goes way back to the conversation about African genius. Mm-hmm. And these alleles, these DNA alleles that we have greater. Maybe there's something we're not using anymore. Mm-hmm. Because we're using Europeans as the standard of what it means to be human. Mm-hmm. So we're lowering our capacity and our potential and possibility, whereas in the back in the day, our folks did it. We just didn't have the scholars to write and to verify, to justify our practice. And then we start giving it up. Well, I don't want nobody come in my room when I'm sick. I want private room. I want private nurse. I want private, and we eliminate all the spirit conversation that's having a conversation with disease. Mm-hmm. To tell disease, you can't have this spirit. Mm-hmm. You can let this spirit go. Mm-hmm. That's the 90% spirit that I think we have to explore. So how does our spirit involve itself in human affairs as a human, not in, but as a human affair?
Mm-hmm. Wade, we have touched on what I think is the essential liberation of African people. This transformation in terms of the way that we perceive the world. I don't know if you read the work. I sent you works on Professor Gabriel Ebo.
Yes, I started reading that. Actually, I started looking at the tapes as well.
Now, what you are saying, he proves mathematically that there's only God, and all things is a transformation of that God force. Mm-hmm. And it's traditional African spiritual systems and traditional African belief. And what he has done is to mathematically prove that. Create an equation that deals with all of the force fields known and unknown in the universe. Gravity, electromagnetic, the weak, the strong. And come up with an equation that models every motion that those force fields create so that you can follow the path. You can literally model it. You can geometrically, mathematically model every motion. And all of it comes out of an understanding that before creation, it looks at the universe as a large space full of motion. And that motion and all of that power and everything else is just God. And those waves of that energy transforms over time and space into everything. It is all conserved. Nothing is lost. No energy is created. No energy is lost, destroyed. It just transforms. So you are God. The table is God. There's only God. And therefore that God consciousness manifests. And when it goes back to ancient Kemetic Ma'atian principles, if you can align yourself with truth, then it is not you who speak, but the universe who speaks through you.
Absolutely.
So this intelligence is now manifesting again in us, and we have returning to our original cells that built pyramids. And so I hear what you're saying, and I want you to help us develop that more in a sense that we can begin to act out of that internalization. What must be done? Because so many of our people find it hard to believe that Professor Ebo and African, they don't find it hard that Einstein came up with.
That's the problem.
But an African
can't do this.
has
A
come
goat
up.
can't do this. How's a goat going to have a profound thought that I should respect? See, how is a sheep or a farm animal, mule, have a profound insight that I should respect? See, that idea of dehumanizing us, seeing us as chattel, is problematic for even the larger world to benefit from our genius, because now they got to some non-African has to take the African thought, steal it or borrow it, and claim it's their own, even for the African to respect the thought.
Correct.
You see, and so that's part of this dilemma. And it seems to me that what has to happen is everywhere we have expertise, we should talk about Africa's understanding of the universe. So he's doing with mathematics. I'm trying to do it in psychology. The historian there should be an African historiography. The political scientists, all these areas of inquiry and investigation have to be Africanized so that we can talk about. See, it's not enough to have this brother talk about it in terms of mathematics and show the mathematical formula that demonstrate it, but how does it get translated to the teaching of math in elementary school? How does it get translated to the management of economy? Because economy is based on grounded in mathematics. How do we talk about an economic system that's based upon an African, the mathematical formula that says energy, spirit, God is everything? You know, how do we make these translations? That's what I think the next challenge is to take these insights that we are rescuing. And we're literally rescuing Africa's deep thought. As modern, contemporary scholars, we're rescuing Africa's deep thought, but that's not enough. We have to then translate it into the stuff that is the walk-around ingredients of life. How I manage a police department in a community. How I manage a healthcare system in a community. Do I even have a police department in a community? Because there's some implications for the need to have police that dominate and control citizens' movements and whereabouts. But how do I manage these things that touch us in our just living in the world? And on any given day, I'm dealing with health issues, I'm dealing with political issues, I'm dealing with economic issues, I'm dealing with relational issues or psychological issues, and all those, on and on and on. But all those have to be grounded in the wisdom traditions of African thought. And the more we understand that deeply, the more it's going to be required that we have translations that are almost like you exchange money when you go to a foreign country. Mm-hmm. You have one. We have dollars. We got to translate them to cedis or naira in Ghana or Nigeria. Mm-hmm. All right, because that's what is negotiable in those places. Well, how do we take our wisdom traditions and translate them into a currency that is negotiable in how we live our lives?
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
That's what we have to do. Absolutely. We have to take those wisdom traditions, those deep thought, and translate it so that I can negotiate how I, as a 13-year-old boy, relates to little girls in junior high school on the schoolyard, up front of the school steps. Mm-hmm. How I, as a 65-year-old man, relate to young people in my community and I walk about way, or how they relate to me. Mm-hmm. Now, all those things, that's translating and giving it contemporary currency. Mm-hmm. See, our ancient wisdom traditions are pristine, they're profound, they're deep, but we haven't translated it to a currency that's usable in West Oakland, in Harlem, in Alabama. That black folk can say, oh yeah, this will buy me this. I use that money analogy. That this is valuable, I can get this for this. We have made Africa have valuable in the exchanging of relationships in life. Africa doesn't have no one looks to Africa. No one asks what did Africa to say about how we manage family. No one says, what did Africa say about how we do human development? You know, from birth to whatever stages we talk about in birth. No one says, look to Africa and say, how do we? What does Africa say about the governance of a civil society? You know, so because we don't look to Africa, because Africa is a place where these less than human beings dwell. And we are their descendants, so we less than human as well. But we got to change that by studying the wisdom traditions and then making the translation. The translation is important because just like you exchange your money, when you in Europe, you got to use the euro. You can't be talking no dollars. When you in China, you use Chinese. So wherever you go, you got to exchange your mediums of exchange. Ideas are like that, mediums of exchange. So we take African ideas and exchange them so that they have currency for how Africans in 2007 in West Oakland, in LA, in Kansas City, how Africans negotiate their worlds based upon African thought.
Now, and I won't keep you because I know your day is tight, but I do want to continue to deal in this area because my work is how do we liberate ourselves? How do we go through we have been transformed into European, into seeing the world through the eyes of Europeans. But yet we are not Europeans, and the way that we see the world is not for us a reality. It does not complement us. It doesn't empower us. And I think the first thing we need to do is to understand the difference between our physical being and our spiritual being, as you touched on before. And I'll give you an example. Amos Wilson talks about different personalities inhabiting the same body, and that one personality can come into the body and the person can be allergic to orange juice, and actually can drink orange juice and have an allergic reaction and die. Where the next personality in that body is not only not allergic to orange juice, but has tremendous physical power and can lift 500 pounds and etc. But yet that's the same body, the same physical mechanism, but spirits moving in that actually think. So there's a whole world that is happening that is affected by consciousness and also by the being of the world itself that we are not quite understanding. Just like we were talking before about the relationship between the preacher and the believer and etc. Now, how do we come into the spiritual transformation? What is the process? How do we begin?
See, I think that it has to. Part of our inability to fully understand the Spirit is that our mental maps for negotiating that the African landscape has been influenced by European thought. And Christianity, at least Western Christianity, has been a contaminant in us fully understanding what spirit is.
Yes.
You see, and so and that's a delicate kind of conversation we need to have. How do we go back and respect the understanding of an ascended spirit called Jesus Christ, and I having the same capacity to ascend, and the physics of how energy moves in the world, because that energy is spirit.
Yes. Yes.
And that's not Christology or religiosity. That's a physics, not a religion. So it seems to me it'll be helpful if we begin to add to our understanding of spirit as a physics phenomena and not a religious phenomena. So we get confused with those. We start about talking about spirit, we talk about spirituality, we talk about religiosity, and we talk about belief in God, but it's an anthropomorphic God. It's a human form of a God, as opposed to, as you said, everything in the universe is energy in some concentrated differential form. So the way this energy is moving makes this a table. The way this energy is moving inside my body makes a heart, a liver, a lung. All those are energies moving, vibrating at different speeds, all right, at different rhythms. And so if I see the world as all these vibratory rhythms, differential speeds, then that's a different way to talk about spirit than to talk about spirit in terms of touching me in the church and I fall out. You see, even though if it's real, that touching me in the spirit, because I have activated my own spiritual vibration to such an intense form that the energy of it becomes like a bullet and can, in fact, move mountains. Right? So, but I think we have to. Scholars have to, particularly African-centered scholars, have to begin to raise the question of spirit, not as the church does it as a bad thing to people, bad people. The churches they use religion to dominate us, but rather to talk about spirit in terms of its quantum idea, in terms of the notion of synapses, where energies come together, and it's that point between them that Foucault talks about in his work of the V's in the universe, and that there are these V's where we, in fact, when we praise God, we create a V. When I reach out to hug you, I create a V, and that V creates energy fields that are particular flavor, particular intensity that has something to do with my being a human being and functioning human being. So we got a whole bunch of work to do around just understanding the process of being a spirit in human form, and not just being a human being, a physical human being. We're spirits in human form. This is the palm tree outside is spirit in a palm tree form. But we are spirits in human form with a consciousness of our own consciousness, and how we understand that is a new frontier for me.
I think that, again, I want to go back to the work of Professor Evo, because I work with him and I see this dynamics going on both in Africa and here. But the problem is getting our people to even believe that such an occurrence has happened, that there is an entirely new world, that African people have been called the leadership by the Creator bringing this equation through an African. It serves the world,
yes,
but it comes through an African. Therefore, Africa has been chosen for this leadership, not the individual Professor Evo, but African people.
But that's Africa's role. We're the mother. We are literally the mother of humanity. And as any good mother, at the point where your children go astray, you have to bring them back. So I would predict that you're going to always see these breakthroughs of genius which is really Mama Africa bringing their children back. We call it a breakthrough, a new insight. But that's just Africa reclaiming what we should be. So I think Africa is always going to be that place. It will always come out of Africa, or out of African genius, because we are the prototype of humanity.
That's correct.
There's no other human form that cannot differentiate itself from us as human essence. To be human is to be African.
Okay, finally, I want you to speak as elaborate as you can on this. There's a new paradigm in the world. I remember when I was young, and you would see Dick Tracy, and he would look at his watch, and there was television, there was the phone, there was everything, and he could talk and everything. And we said, man, you know,
Unbelievable.
unbelievable. But today, I mean, that's kid stuff.
That's right.
You know, I got in the car, man, I just put your address on, you know, in the car. Because, you know, I ain't know how to come to Phoenix here.
Yeah.
It said, go down, you know, make a right, make a left. It told me every step of the way, right to your door. And when I got in front of your house, it said, destination reached. There's a new paradigm. Professor Ebo gives us the mathematics for cold fusion, which means that we can literally run the city off of a glass of water, because he gives us the understanding of how the universe operates. So how creation is forming, and therefore by understanding that and being able to map it geometrically, demolish geometrically, you got a whole new paradigm. The same as when we looked at Dick Tracy. But once you get the image out and people begin to see it, you're literally bringing it from the spiritual down to all you got to do is draw the grid. I mean, you can draw the blueprint of this house. Any mechanic, a good engineer, good architect, you know, can build it. So we're now beginning to structure the blueprint for this new paradigm. Europeans have moved in place. They're studying it, and they're positioning themselves to take advantage of this new paradigm. But we are not. And I wanted you to speak to...
Well, see, that goes back to the idea of these mental maps. We don't see ourselves as leading the world. We don't see ourselves as being the standard of humanity. And so we almost have to sit and wait for Europe to say this is something worthy of your attention before we attend to it. That's one of the shatterings of our. See, I thought our humanity was destroyed. I think it was shattered. We got cracks in it, and that's one of the cracks that we don't see ourselves as being the standard of humanity. And unfortunately, though, I think there's something missing in European consciousness that allows them to see human value as only valuable to the extent that it can be exploited. And so even though we can show that you could run the city of Oakland on a glass of water, that would not be embraced, because I want you to drive down the street and pay $3 a gallon for oil that's imported from a country that I'm killing people and exploiting them to steal the oil from them. So this sort of exploitative, capitalistic notion of human relationship prevents us as a world community from fully recognizing that we can create literally heaven on earth now that we have broken open some of the hidden laws of the universe that were embedded in African wisdom traditions. Now that we've uncovered those laws, we can change the way humans in this entire planet live for long times, and live in a very, very harmonious, health-producing environment, as opposed to struggling in these decadent, disease-oriented environments, because the decadent and disease-oriented environment allows me to accumulate capital at your exploitation. See, that's a cancer in the human body. This idea that humans can be, should be, sometimes without my willingness, be exploited is a cancer. And that cancer is fed by capitalism, for me, by capitalism and white supremacy. They go hand in hand. And so you're not going to see people say, oh wait, let's now exploit this genius in the good sense of exploitation. Let's maximize our benefit of it from it. We don't see that. We see people holding it. Sometimes even, like you said, the authors of the study copyrighted it and then put it in the bottom drawer. We don't folk to know that. Why? Because if they know that, that breaks us out of dependency on a different conception that associated with our own experience. So a lot of the stuff that I think that a lot of the insights that's coming out of our mining, digging into Africa's wisdom traditions aren't going to be readily applicable because there's an opposition to it being utilized. Because that opposition is benefiting, that narrow community is benefiting from exploiting the world and the world's resources. So I would never sit and go to Gulf Oil and say, we can run a city with a glass of water. Gulf Oil people will run you out of this. No, we're gonna be oil dependent. You know, and so there are these oppositions that are doing exploiting people economically that gets in the way of us fully exploring our own African wisdom traditions. And the idolatry that we suffer from in terms of white people, we really practice idolatry. We make white people idols, like the graven idol. We practice idolatry to the white people that we don't allow ourselves to say, let's look and ask, what did Africa have to say about that? What can I learn from the African wisdom traditions? But we always run to Europe.
When someone died, they brought him home, and they were in the house overnight, you know, and everybody would come by and sit with the family, and you know, and the deceased would be laying right up there with us. And they did wash the
good.
And they did wash the body. They did all the things.
We've done it for thousands of years that way.
That's what I wanted you to touch on, because I had forgotten about that. And you're saying that this has a significance.
I think it has I really believe that our way, that as African people, our way has been, and I use this with my students, that we've been derailed. That African culture and being was not destroyed by slavery or by colonialism. But if you think about the analogy of a train being on its track, going to a station or to its destiny, and being derailed, that train goes off its track. African people and African culture is like that. We've been derailed. We're still moving, we're still inventing, we're still creating, but we're off our track. And so we have these like the what do you call them, the baggage cars of the train. There, some may go to Jamaica. Some, as a train, the cars go different directions. Some went to Jamaica, some went to Brazil, some went to Alabama, some went to Mississippi. It's still all part of the same train, but they're derailed. And in many ways, it is part of our process to re-rail ourselves, to re-Africanize ourselves, and look at the fact that for thousands of years, African people have created things that made sense in terms of the complementarity between the spirit and the body, and seeing the body really as the container of the spirit. That's what really we saw the body as just a container of the spirit. And so the example I was just giving a moment ago about the preparation of the body for transition into the afterlife. Well, we just in our lifetimes, we did that ourselves. As you just mentioned off camera, that old folks used to bring the body home in the South, and folks would take care of the body. And we see that going far back into ancient Kemet, that the oiling of the body, the placing of flowers on the body, the preparing of the body so that the soul could walk into the afterlife. You see, and we've done it for 1,000 years, but then it wasn't because we just were like to wash dead bodies. It was, in fact, it had some psychological import, and that's the piece that I can't stress heavily enough. Is that our practices and our rituals, our traditional practices and rituals of African people had psychological import for what made us healthy and well as human beings. And since in being derailed, we now see all this other stuff. We see us having the same pathologies that Europeans have. We see the same disease as Europeans have because we're off our path and we're sort of on their path. and on their path we take on the same ailments that they have. And so what we have to do is get back on our path. Look at those things. I'm saying examine them. If we could reinstitute in our communities. I'm not trying to run the undertakers out of business, because they're an important part of our tradition and a valuable asset in our communities. But if we could, in fact, begin to talk about how do we look at just those moments of rite of passage. Death is a rite of passage. Birth is a rite of passage. Look at those moments and talk about what should be the family's responsibility, what should be the community's responsibility, what part should be given to the professionals to handle, and then add those things to our normal everyday lifestyles. I think would have a stronger and more healthy community. Mm-hmm. But it has to be thought about. We have to think about what are the significant moments that we should not allow no one else to interfere with in terms of black people. And it seems to me, I keep listening about birth, rite of passage to puberty, to be adult, eldership, death. Those are just the major ones. There's something in between those. But those, we should have community ceremonies and celebrations that point those out and say we're impacting on the psychology of the community. What does it do for a young child who's 9, 10, 11, going through puberty, and while he's struggling with those raging hormones, the community brings him together and sets him down and celebrates and talks about the responsibility of the man, being a man, gives him recognition and respect and high praise. That does something, because now I'm saying the community says I am of worth, whereas we don't do it. We do it silently, and nothing happens, and I hang out in the gym with my cut buddies, and those raging hormones saying, I see the sister with that big butt over there, and so I'm going to try to get some. And so then their rite of passage is, how many girls can they get, as opposed to I'm in relationship with my community, and what are my responsibilities for the community as a man. See, those celebrations, not just it's celebration, but it's not just having a party and gifts and food and stuff, but it's also internalizing in my very being that I have an unbreakable connection with my community, and I have a responsibility to make my community better at every moment of my moving in life.
Can you, because there are many rites of passage programs, and we're trying to institute them everywhere, because you're correct.
Yes.
Perhaps you can give us some guidelines. You talked about, moving from puberty, into, I guess that's about, 9, 10, 12. 13, Give us some of the things that we should do in these rites of passage.
Well, see, I think everything has to be, and I can't really give you something like a prescription, but I can give an outline here. I think everything in every stage, we should be reinforcing the ideas about confidence, competence, and consciousness. So at 4-year-old, what are the competencies that little boys and little girls should know? What should they be able to do? Again, if I flash back in the day, our grandparents knew that. They knew that at some point, I'm going to give you a couple of nickels and tell you to go down the street and buy a loaf of bread and bring it back by yourself, and make sure you count your change. That was a task of competence. Mm-hmm. It was also a task of confidence. That mommy's not with you all the time. You're going to be able to take care of the family's business and be confident about it. You, as a little 5-year-old, got to tell that big grown grocery store man, most of the time not a member of our community, that you didn't give me the right change. That's confidence. And then consciousness has to do with being aware of who you are. You are an African child. You see, so those 3 C's, it seemed to me, are the critical markers for all rites of passage. But what you do at each stage, what am I doing to instill competence in the young people who are being transitioned to the next level? What do I do to reinforce their confidence? And that confidence, for me, seems to me, is probably, they're all equally important, but the confidence one is important because the confidence one is associated with warriorship. And if we don't have confidence, we never become warriors. We never have the strength or the courage to stare down the enemy or to fight that which is detrimental to my community. So for me, and this may be male energy, and a sister may see the consciousness being more important, but for me, we got to make sure that young black boys grow up with a sense of confidence that they can handle it. That whatever it is, they can defend and protect their community and advance the community. And that's so they're all linked together: competence, confidence, and consciousness at every level. So at puberty, what's my competence? My competency is not can I score on the little girls, because that little boys think that's being competent. Man, I got 4 or 5 girlfriends. I'm competent. But that's not it. So we have to figure out as adults what are the areas, the arenas where the young people express their competence, confidence, and consciousness on all those marker points, from puberty to entering adulthood, to entering eldership, and even to the point of transition to the afterlife. There's a competency there that we haven't even thought about, that the ancient Kemites did. That's why the ancient Kemites, when they buried ourselves, they buried us with the tools that we would need in the afterlife. They didn't just put books and incense and medicine in the sarcophagus with us for no reason. They put them because they knew you had a responsibility living in the afterlife to do for your community as well. So we're not even thinking about those kinds of things, you see? And so I don't have here's what you do in the rites of passage. The rite of passage should be seen as just that. It is a moment in time where the community gives you the right to pass to the next level of challenge. Mm-hmm. That's what rite of passage does. So it's not just doing stuff. It is you're preparing yourself, and at some point, the community sits in judgment. Just like in the hall of the double mati in ancient Kemet, you sit in judgment, and the community says, based upon your performance, based upon your ability, based upon your expressed ideas about who you are, the community then judges you and says, yes, you have the right now. The community gives you the rights. It's not me, not even me as a teacher. It is the community that says, based upon what we see in this cadre of young people, they have the right. And it's always collective. There's not no individual stuff going on. This group can go forward to the next level of challenge, because every level has a challenge. The challenges that I had when I was 9 were different from the challenges I had when I was 15, which were different from the challenges I had when I was 21. They're different from the challenges I had when I was 35. They're different from the challenges I have now knocking on 60. But there are always challenges that are ahead of us, and you have to be able to be judged as having the competency, the confidence, and the consciousness to meet those challenges. That's what a rite of passage program, in my estimation, should do. You should recognize that I'm giving you the right now to address a new set of challenges, and that goes on eternally. If I get to be 90, 100, my next moment is going to be another set of challenges, and at some point, if we were doing this right, we should have some elder people telling the 100-year-old people that you have a right to go on to the next level of challenges. Mm-hmm. What is the challenges for the people who are going to be dealing with the 120-year-old phenomena?
I want to interject. This is kind of off the topic. It's on the topic, but I wanted to lay out in this rites of passage questions that every young person should be able to answer about what they need to know about Africa, or what they need to know about Black people. And I know I'm just throwing this out on you, and you may not have given it some thought, but if you would pull some things together, what is it that every young person should know about Africa, and every young person should know about Africans living right here in America?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's one that I'd want to think about. But without thinking, so there's my caution. Without thinking about that question, I think that what every young African should know, every African child in America should know, is that they are African. Mm-hmm. That's an important thing, that they are African, and that Africa as a geographical place, while important, Africa as a spiritual place is more important. That Africa is in us. It's not some place to go to. Even though we can go to Africa, to the continent, we can go there. And in conceptualizing that going to Africa is very much like going back home to my mother's house. Mm-hmm. And I say this very intentionally. If I go home to my mother's house and the step is broken, I automatically try to fix it, or I find the resources to fix it. If the sink is stopped up, then I will fix that sink. I will sit at my mother's kitchen table, and I will sit there with honor and respect, and we will talk about what we need to do to make sure that my mother is okay. That's the relationship we should have to Africa. That if we are African, whatever is the condition of Africa, including Africans who are in Africa, who are doing the wrong thing in Africa, we should challenge them because they are defiling our mother's house. So we should have a relationship to Africa as being our mother's house. But again, I don't want us to go away with, and I think this may have been the difficulty that Marcus Garvey had. of Africans wanting to go back to Africa as a place, as opposed to Africans going into Africa, inside themselves as a place. And then wherever I am, if you look around this institute, wherever I am, I'm going to have it reflect Africa. Because if Africa is in me, I cannot feel comfortable in this office if it doesn't feel like Africa. When I walk down the street, I can't feel comfortable if the nature of relationships in my community don't feel like Africa. And that's a big thing for us in America, is we have to constantly try to find a comfort zone in our own communities, and we don't do that because we think it's just rehabilitating houses, or trying to get people to not tear down the projects. But it really is, how do I create an environment that fits my spirit? It's like the clothes we wear. I wear certain kind of clothes based upon my conversation with the environment. If the environment is very, very cold, I put on heavier clothes. If the environment is very, very hot, I put on light flowing clothes. So my clothes, I have a conversation with my environment. If I'm an African, I have to have a conversation with my environment. So the lesson for me, the fundamental first starting point is to be African. And I think Asa makes his point several years ago, National Association of Black Psychologists, that the fundamental question is to be African or not to be. It is that fundamental, to be African or not to be. And so if I'm African, then everything around me, including the continent of Africa, has to be seen as my responsibility.
Well, perhaps we can juxtapose that to being European. What are the major differences? I mean, if Africa is in us, yes, and we must go in us. We must understand, we must be ourselves, because as Dr. Weaver says, right now we are actors. We acting. We even got stage names, Brown, Smith, Jones. And these roles we play, and we are certainly acting. But how do we know when we are ourselves? What is it?
That's the fundamental question. I think that, and I think that, to me, the exciting part is that the question has been raised to be African. The question has been raised. And now it's our job as the intellectuals, the scholars, as the activists, as the practitioners, to talk about what does that look like then. Because, you think about it, in our lifetime, the question to be African was not raised overtly or intentionally. Black folks were just being African. Back in the day, our grandmamas, they were just being African, but they didn't call it African. But now we kind of got away from that, and now the question is being raised to be African. And so now, once the question is raised, that's very important. And I'm sad about just the question to be African, because once I raise that, that's well, how do I live as an African man? What do I do? How do I relate to women? How do I relate to other men? How do I relate to old, to young? If I'm African, how do I do that? And I can't say, well, it's the opposite of what white folks do. See, that's a problematic there. Is a lot of times we intellectuals say, well, white folks do this, we must be the opposite of that. But that's not true. They're irrelevant to the conversation. To compare ourselves to them in contrast or in comparison is irrelevant. It is in fact, for me, it's misleading. That we simply have to stand on, as Baba Fukiao says, we have to stand on African ground and then see the world deep in African soil. And he's not talking about land, he's talking about spirit here. You see, and we have to stand on African ground and then have the conversation. If you and I are roughly the same age, what's our responsibility as African men for guiding younger men? But I never think that through if I don't raise the question to be African. You see, and so I don't think we have it laid out in detail. Nor do I believe that necessarily has to happen, because it changes every time. Think about it. Right now, you're sitting here talking to me with this wonderful high-tech camera. We didn't have that when we were boys.
That's right.
And so just the knowledge of how to use that instrumentation is a challenge that this generation takes for granted. It wasn't long ago, folk our age would say, I gotta wait for my grandson to come over here to set this VCR up. I don't know how to work this VCR. And so we would say that there's a technology that we don't know how to do. But so there are going to be inventions, human inventions, every other day that we have to master. The question for me is not the invention. The question is that no matter what the invention is, I have to be African in relating to it. See, so we can internalize this idea of being African, then whatever the challenge is that I got, what does an African do in this situation? Being African, being this energy, this power, this force. And I think that's what we are as human beings. To be a person for African people is to be a spirit. to be a spirit. Now, as a spirit, how do I relate to this technology? How do I, for example, manage a freestanding black think tank? And how do I relate to people who are, quote, called staff? And how do I get projects completed in an African way? You see, because it isn't that's just old black stuff. They never get this stuff done on time. No, we have to do things like get proposals in on time if we're going to be funded to do the work. We can't sit around and say, yeah, we just having a good time over here. This is a cool place to work. No, there are tasks to be addressed and achieved. But how do we do that in Africa? I think it has to do with the relationship. Mm-hmm. How do I relate to you? Even though I want to get a result, the bottom line is, did I get the grant? Even though that's true, but it's the relationship that makes it African. How do I, for example, inspire people as opposed to manipulate them to do work? So I can manipulate you, saying, I'm going to give you a raise, or I'm going to punish you, I'm going to fire you, I'm going to dock you, I'm going to manipulate you with fear to do work, or I can inspire you to do work. And it seems to me that the African relationship is one of inspiration, not manipulation. So we got to think about what it is to be African, and then say, now, given this task that I'm dealing with managing a company, I'm dealing with teaching some young people at the university, I'm dealing with trying to have some laborers work with me on my farm, I'm dealing with whatever the task is. I got to approach that with, how do I do that as an African? That's the challenge. We have to work. We work that out. We're working out. We did it all along. How did the ancients get, in spite of the media, the movies' portrayal of ancient Egypt or any of our historical points, how did our ancestors get an entire population to work on one single project, the building of the Great Sphinx? Everybody was working on it. How do you get people to do that? You can't say we had the big burly black ones with the whip beating people to drag the stones there. I mean, people were actually being born, living, having children, and their children being born and living and all working on the same project. And we have a hard time having 5 black folk get together to talk about how we're going to go down to City Hall to struggle with something. You see what I'm saying? That there's the necessary condition is to be African. And after that, everything else is a problem that we solve as Africans. How do we live in community? How do we live in community? We have to live in community as African. If we don't do that, then we end up living in community like the Europeans or like white folks, end up doing the same thing they do. I'm living large because I live in a, in quote, gated community. Nobody can get into my community. We got a big wall around it. That's not living in community. For Africans, for some other people it may be, but I'm not concerned about them. So we don't need to compare or contrast. We simply say, let's start with being African and then ask ourselves, what do we do as Africans? For whatever the problematic of life is. And life is a whole series of problems that we solve, or puzzles that we solve. Whatever the puzzle is that we have to solve, I got to solve it as an African.
Have you ever thought about pulling all those people together, thousands of them working on one project, the Sphinx? Have you ever thought about why or what it meant or why you could do that? Because I think if you can understand why they built the monuments, why they built pyramids, why they built temples, then you would be into the psyche. What propelled them? What were their principles? What were they all about? So once you know that, then those buildings and symbols no longer have a mystery. You're in them.
That's right.
And you live in them. So have you ever thought about why they put those temples up, why they put the pyramids up, why they sculptured that humongous...
Yes. I haven't thought about it deeply, or at least not extensively, but it seems to me that the fundamental meaning of being a human being for African is to be spirit. And everything material is a manifestation of my spirit. And so the great pyramids, the great Sphinx, the great Wall of Zimbabwe, all these great physical monuments are simply symbolic representations of the power of our spirit. And that's why each individual person could commit themselves to it, because they were simply creating a physical manifestation of themselves. You see, so the Great Pyramid is while yes, it has some astronomical utility. It has some religious utility. It has some maybe astrological and religious utility. It even has some mathematical utility. The fact of the matter is that, for me, it seems to me that the creation of those monuments, was simply to create a physical, symbolic manifestation of the power of my spirit. And not my individual, but my, meaning African people's spirit.
I want to come back. You were talking about healing in the community, and the sisters who are healers, critical. Talk about it.
Well, it's just our traditions. There's nothing. We're not inventing anything new. We actually are rescuing and reclaiming, as Maulana Karinga likes to say. We are rescuing and reclaiming that which is ours. And so we have had a tradition of the importance of that, again, that feminine energy being a nurturing and a healing energy, and that those old women with those old hands and wise minds would be in the community, and in our lifetime, their door was never locked. You could always go to their houses on their stoop or in their house. There would always be something on the back of the stove cooking, and they weren't necessarily related to you by blood. They were just old people, Miss Wilson and Miss Jones, different people. All the children community know that was like a safe haven. That was just a place that you go and sit on the stairs and get revitalized. So we don't know what the magic of their healing was, but we do know that these women had this responsibility, and they were in the community. They weren't seen as being necessarily the midwives or the doctors, even though they served that function. But they were there to doing what they do. Some of them worked even for white folks and washing their clothes and stuff. But they were seen as the magnet, the source of healing and health in our community. So we've sort of taken that historical tradition and are now testing out, can that be reintroduced in our community today? Can we educate just regular black women in our community around the issues of HIV/AIDS, the epidemiology of the AIDS, the way in which the virus is contracted? Can we also educate them about reclaiming traditions and rituals that they could reintroduce in their homes and in their community, and then literally certify them as healer women, and then let them just live in their community. They may be working in a bank, they may be school teachers, they may be unemployed, they may be welfare, but they've gone through this program and process, and now they're healer women. And then in doing what they do in their normal lives, they're able to identify where there is dis-at-ease and to rectify it. They're able to provide healing and prevention techniques for our community. They're just taking our own tradition and using it in 2004. That's all we're doing. But we're training them with facts and information. So they're trained to know and understand about HIV/AIDS and substance abuse prevention. They're trained to know about how you, in fact, can help people to change their behavior. They're trained to do an analysis of choices and chances, and how people can make wrong choices or dangerous chances, and how you help them to see that and reflect on that. They're trained to do all of that, and then they just do what they do normally in their community. They may be sitting in the beauty parlor and just doing what women do at the beauty parlor. But in doing it, they're able to identify dis-at-ease and to interject in the conversation, in the dialogue, in the dynamic, a healing balm. Mm-hmm. That's the purpose of this project.
Now, I just got a couple more questions I want to ask you. But I do want to, again, revisit white psychology and juxtaposing it to an African-centered way of treating, healing, looking at the world. We are controlled by Eurocentric thinking. A Jewish fellow said to me, he said, well, he actually said it to a young blood, but he said, y'all can't win. And Blood said, why? He said, you women are against you. He said, and your children are educated by your enemy. How can a black man get out of that? The question that I'm asking is, we look at Euro education, Euro psychology, and treating and training. What's happening? What's up with that? Where are we going? I mean, how is that the nail in the coffin How is it?
Yeah. I have tried not to think a lot about European psychology, but I'm going to try to honor your question. Since our physical emancipation, we have been the victims of psychological warfare and didn't know it.
Yes.
It's been psychological warfare. And even this Jewish person's interpretation of our condition is another assault on our psychology. Because what I do know as a psychologist is that I want people to think and see the world the way I see it. If I can get them to think and see the world the way I see it, they can never defeat me. And so by him offering his interpretation that our women are against us, our children are being taught by Europeans, we could never win. If we take that interpretation, he has won already. He's not outside of our enemies. He's not separate from our enemies. And the fact of the matter is that while there are many difficulties between black men and women in the world, it was imposed on us by taking European models of male-female relationships. So part of the solution there is simply to recognize that here's the thrust of European psychology that I recognize and I let it go, is that European psychology's power is in taking the position that is not European psychology, it is human psychology. And they want us to believe that psychology is about human beings. And if I'm a human being, then it must apply to me. But the moment I recognize that psychology is about a small population in the world called Europeans, then I have the power to say, wait a minute, that may not apply to me. That's just about them. And once I recognize that it doesn't apply to me, then I can resist it. But if I give them the license to say their psychology is human psychology, then I have to apply it to myself. That's the trick bag. That's the sneak attack for your white psychology, is to present itself as human psychology. It is not human psychology. It is the psychology of a small, narrow part of the human family. And I'm not, though they may be my distant cousins, but they're not in my household. And so once I make that conceptual break, then I can begin to talk about, well, what psychology should be applying to me. That's the task. And the fact of the matter is that even though we're being trained by our enemy, once we recognize you're being trained by your enemy, you take what you can use and you leave the other alone. And I think that's been the history of black intellectual tradition in America. It has always been about the redemption of black folk. Even though we were dealing with white data sets, white information, white historiography, it's been about how do I redeem the character and the culture and the quality of black people. And so the idea that being trained by the enemy makes you automatically lose is not true. But if they convince you that, then it does become true. You follow me? And so for me, I dismiss European psychology only to the point that I say European psychology is valuable as a psychologist only to the extent that it helps me understand how we are not African, not how we are African. And Du Bois says this in terms of we being two warring idols in one dark body whose dogged strength keeps us from being torn asunder. That we are African and not African at the same time. And what the European psychology gives me insight on is the not African, because that's where the destruction is going on. Where the construction is us being African. That's what we need to have a black psychology or African psychology. And I would even say that the Asian need to have an Asian psychology, the Hispanics need to have Hispanic psychology, the Native Americans need to have a Native American psychology, because people need to stand on their own cultural ground to understand their humanity. So I don't give a lot of attention to European psychology, because I recognize very early on in my career that it is applicable, and in many ways it is not accurate in even explaining the psychology of white folks. But it is their stuff. That's for their psychologists to help work through. But the fact of the matter is that it has some great limitations in understanding this phenomena called human being. And it certainly is not universal. It's not for all human beings. And once I do that, then I'm free. I'm free of saying, well, how do I put myself in a Freudian psychoanalytical framework where I have this ego and I have this desire to kill my daddy and to screw my mama. Now that's the vulgar interpretation of Freudian's ego theory. Then how do I put that stuff in it?
I have never had no such inspiration. I've never talked to any black person in my life who said they wanted to kill their daddy and have sex with their mama. I've never, in fact, I've never had any. So that tells me that applies to a small group of people. In terms of what makes me function as a human being, I got to come up with another framework, another model. And it's not out of Oedipus Rex in the Greek trilogy. You see, Freud went to his base. He went to his base. He said, my base is Greek philosophy. So he went to his base and got an analogy to talk about psychology. And that part is true. But we got to go to our base. We can't go to the Greeks and the Romans. We got to go to our base. We got to go to the ancient Kemites. We got to go to the ancient Nubians and pull our analogies from that to talk about here's the normal relationship of human beings.
Mm-hmm. My final question, and I'm still working on that piece on the African burial ground. So everybody I interview, I ask them this question. What is it that you think that our ancestors would want us to know about themselves and about the people who captured them and brought them here as prisoners of war, since we are still their children,
yes,
and we are still here prisoners of war? What is it, again, that they would want us to know about themselves and the people who captured?
Yeah, I think that they would want us to quiet ourselves long enough to hear them, because they're telling us what they want. It's not me to do it. Our ancestors are living energy, living force, and they are telling us what they want us to do. One of which is to speak their rightful claim of possibility in life. See, part of being victims of enslavement and being captives of war is that they could never fulfill all their possibility and potential in life. They could never wonder about being something that was never seen in the world before. All right, you follow me?
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems to me that our ancestors are now part of it. All these that are being uncovered, the burial grounds, the relationship of to the dungeons on west coast of Africa. All these things that are now becoming significant have always been there. The burial ground was always there, but it's only become significant and quote discovered now. Why? Because I believe our ancestors know that we are now strong enough to deal on their behalf, to speak their claim. Back in the 30s, or for that matter, back in the 20th century, we weren't strong enough. We were so recently derailed that we were just holding on, like in a derailed train. You're just holding on. Don't know what this is gonna blow up or not. You're just holding on. That's but now we kind of rolling with the flow. And so we now say, wait a minute, can we get in charge of this? Can we redirect this thing? Can we find where the engine room is so we can get the steering wheel? See, now we're strong to do all of that, and the ancestors are speaking directly to us. That's our job. So I think they clearly want us to know, that to speak their claim. Part of that claim is to recognize that they did not conspire with the Europeans that enslaved us, and that's a new kind of message going on now. That black folks had slaves, and what about the field Negroes and the house Negroes? What I think one of the things that I'm hearing, and I don't want to be too mystical here, but one of the things I'm hearing from the ancestral voice is to recognize that there's no way that they would have conspired with the European, with their barbarism and their savagery, to work against other African people. That just in our job is uncover the evidence that demonstrates that. Jesus. You want to go to people's spots, or I can just bring them out and take people out?